Louis Theroux recently made a documentary you may have seen people talking about called Inside the Manosphere. The Manosphere, for those who are unfamiliar, is the online world of misogyny, promoting hypermasculinity, sexism, and the opposing of feminism. It's made up of pick-up artists, men rights activists, and incels.
Hello everybody. Many of you will have seen Louis Theroux's documentary on Netflix, Inside the Manosphere, from a couple of months back. I can't show the official release poster as it's copyright protected, but it's the one where a man has got Louis Theroux in a headlock. From my point of view, the content of this documentary was as expected, but it was the magnitude of the follow-up to it that really prompted me to make this video. I was recently at Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park with some of the other men's rights activists, shown here, and I lost count of the number of people who asked about a certain HS Tiki-Toki who appeared in that documentary. In one case I was asked if I knew him, and of course the response from all of us was that none of us had ever heard of HS Tiki-Toki prior to Louis Theroux's piece. So I'm going to give my take on the documentary. I won't be showing any clips from it. One, I refuse to subscribe to Netflix, and two, I'm concerned about copyright issues. But what is probably the best critique of it was a panel discussion from Manosphere, Janice Fiamengo, Tom Golden and James Nuzzo in their analysis. What Louis Theroux refused to show about the Manosphere. I've linked the full discussion below, and I'd like to thank them for doing much of the heavy lifting here, saving me time in making this video. So let's get into it. Louis Theroux interviewed some influencers and podcasters, HS Tiki-Toki and three others, who I won't bother mentioning as they have no relevance to the men's rights movement. And despite numerous attempts, Theroux was unable to secure an interview with Andrew Tate himself, as Tate demanded money to participate. The media always paint Theroux as a gentleman, but I'm going in on him in this video, showing what a disingenuous, hypocritical and spiteful man he truly is. His documentary was a complete misrepresentation of the Manosphere. In fact, it's not a documentary, it's a narrative-driven hit piece to frame men and men's rights as a problem, and sell that narrative as the truth. First of all, let's understand what journalism is meant to be. The point of journalism is exactly the same as the point of research, to investigate the unknown and report on your findings. That's what a PhD student does. Journalism should be no different. Jordan Peterson, after his famous gotcha moment with Cathy Newman, brilliantly put it, "This woman is an activist, not a journalist." Activism is precisely the antithesis of journalism. The documentary was Louis Theroux's personal feelings, just as Netflix's Adolescence was not a documentary but a TV series. Try contrasting this with Cassie Jay's Red Pill, which although being the first documentary of its kind for men's rights, still gave a significant portion over to the feminist movement to give their views in order to keep the documentary balanced. What people like Louis Theroux do is to create a straw man that they can beat upon by taking a noble cause like men's rights and conflating it with negative aspects of men, using one of the oldest propaganda tricks in the book, guilt by association. So let's give a subtle example of guilt by association to demonstrate. I typed into ChatGPT, "Show me an image of an incel's bedroom." This is what I got. Now I'll give you a few seconds to see if you can spot it, or pause the video if you prefer. It's the red pill on the wall in the top centre. Ergo, the red pill, instead of being a sincere and decent philosophy that redressed the imbalance for half the world's population, is now dangerous and extreme. That is guilt by association, and that is exactly what Louis Theroux is doing. He took some crass men like HS Tiki-Toki and used this guilt by association concept to misrepresent the men's rights movement. And the whole documentary used a sinister soundtrack. Why do you need a soundtrack to make your argument work? It's called propaganda. Now let's look at what men's rights is really about. We live in a culture where a man who marries can have his family taken away from him on any woman's whim. Not any woman will do this, but any woman can. No man can be sure that his children will remain with him throughout his life, however much he loves them. The general acceptance of circumcising baby boys, but the sheer revulsion when done to girls. That is called a circumstraint board, and yes, those are arm and leg constraints for the baby. Next, a huge prison sentencing gap. Healthcare provision. Diversity, equity and inclusion hiring that discriminates against men. Paternity fraud. Lack of anonymity for suspected sexual offenders. Lack of political representation. And yes, you heard that right, feminists. I'm not talking about the gender of the politicians, I'm talking about the policies themselves. Now I could go on and on and on. We all know the statistics. Men make up 80% of suicides. 94% of workplace deaths are men. 85% of the homeless are men. Boys are dropping out from school. What does Louis Theroux's documentary have to say about any of this? Well, literally nothing. Not a single second of caring, kindness or concern about any of these issues. If you're making a documentary about men, how do you leave all that out? This was done deliberately. When you consider that the biggest killer of middle-aged men is suicide, and the biggest killer of young men is suicide, coupled with the fact that the majority of these men had no prior mental health issues, then something clearly happened to these men. This should be as obvious as a herd of elephants stampeding through the room. And as certain as night turns into day, if it was the other way round, this fact would be firmly embedded in the human psyche. Now let's get Louis Theroux right. He presents himself as a nice guy, but let's look at who he really is. He's a far left influencer who's worked for Michael Moore and the BBC. He has an air of superiority, portraying the men in his documentary as paranoid when they don't need to be. He was patronising and showing faux sympathy. It's very rich that a man who makes a very good living making documentaries for the BBC, in other words taxpayer-funded documentaries, should show such scorn to others. And he feels the right to pompously morally lecture men like HS Tiki-Toki who are trying to make their own living with their own social media and somehow expects them to go back to nothing. Why is he so concerned about what these men are earning? Has anybody questioned what Louis Theroux earns? Louis is clearly a male feminist, and it is for these men that I reserve my deepest contempt. There is nothing more pathetic on God's green earth than a man who abases himself to feminism. Weak, brainwashed, and obsequious. Louis, your disingenuous culture war and gaslighting has profoundly inhibited the rights of men and boys. And as I said at the beginning, I noticed this firsthand at Speaker's Corner. And I have no doubt this will lead to more men losing their lives. So, Louis Theroux, I award you this prestigious award. You truly are King of the Cucks. And yes, the C can mean what you want it to mean. Thank you for watching, everyone.